Joining us now is a returning guest, somebody that got a lot of really, really great feedback for us the last time that he was on, Ryan McBeth, an open source intelligence analyst. Welcome back to the show, Ryan.
Justin, thank you so much for inviting me back on here. I love coming on your show.
So I thank you for the pleasantries, and it is equally delightful that you are back on, and we're going to be talking about some fairly grim subject matter for this interview, because obviously we are looking at a lot of violence in the international stage. They are very much playing into where we are politically right now, and specifically in both of the major theaters of America's involvement in foreign affairs are questions of war crimes. And it has largely become something that has become a part of domestic politics, not only with the administration's involvement in both theaters in Ukraine and in Gaza, but also just broadly. And so what I wanted to have you on for is to just have, from your perspective, a data dump on the general term. When we say war crimes, what are war crimes? Because we know war is hell. We know that horrifying things that we would never want to happen in a time of peace happen during war, but we also know that some things cross that line. So where would we start from a novice's perspective on understanding what a war crime is?
So there would be three parts to this. There would be the very base minimum, which is called the Geneva Conventions, and there were 4 of them. And this was originally kind of started by the Red Cross. I believe it was during the British incursion in Crimea, where this guy who was, I believe he was a traveling reporter, he was looking at some atrocities that had been committed, and he thought, oh my God, there's got to be a better way to do this. So that there is the Geneva Convention, which is essentially the minimum standard for behavior. Then there is something called the LOAC, or the Law of Armed Conflict. The Law of Armed Conflict is the guiding spirit and the general direction that countries have developed, essentially norms of how they would behave in conflict. So you have the Geneva Convention as the base,
okay,
and the LOAC sits on top of that. And on top of the LOAC sits something called the ROE, or Rules of Engagement. Not every military might issue a ROE, or Rules of Engagement, but essentially rules of engagement are rules that are given to soldiers before they go into combat. And these rules of engagement might change. For example, while in Iraq, it was pretty common to see vehicles with a sign on the back that said, "Stay back 100 meters or you will be shot." And it said that in English and in Arabic. So that was part of your ROE, your rules of engagement. If a vehicle comes within 100 meters, you may shoot them, whether you think they're acting in a threatening manner or not. Now, if you violate the rules of engagement, if you violate the LOAC, or if you violate the Geneva Convention, that could be considered a war crime. Although the ROE, the rules of engagement, might only be considered a crime by your country. Violating the Geneva Convention or the LOAC would be considered an international crime.
So before we get into some of that specifically, I want to ask you about the general spirit of this. Are these agreements made as a way of saying, well, we're going to get past these conflicts, as ugly and bloody as they might be, faster if this level of behavior is broadly not tolerated, or there is some mechanism to punish those that engage in it? Or is it just a Western ideal of, hey, this is an evolved way for us to deal with already bloody and violent conflicts?
I think it's a way of codifying a sort of martial spirit that has been part of the military for hundreds of years. There is a certain term called the honors of war, which was actually, I believe it was codified into the law of armed conflict. Honors of war is where you might let a surrendering enemy leave their fortification, and they march out under arms, with you standing at attention, saluting them for their bravery while they were fighting you. I believe the last time this was done was during World War II. And it is still a thing. It is a thing that people can do. So I believe kind of what we're going for with these rules is that it establishes and codifies a level of behavior that professional soldiers are expected to adhere to when engaging in conflict.
So with any rules comes attendant punishments. You mentioned rules of engagement are probably the most specific level of a war that could be considered a war crime, but that is punishable to the side that has issued these rules of engagement, that any actor within acting under this banner should be punished for it. The other two are international. So if one is self-policing, what are the mechanisms to punish a country, a soldier, a general, somebody who commits a war crime under the LOAC or the Geneva Convention?
So under the Geneva Convention and the LOAC, you can still be punished by your host nation if you committed a war crime that wasn't part of the, let's say, the rules of engagement. You chose to commit some kind of war crime, let's say looting. Looting might not be in the rules of engagement because the rules of engagement tend to be about how you're going to shoot your rifle. But it's still, I believe they actually call it pillage in the Geneva Convention. They kind of use older terms, these more older legal terms. But pillage, I believe, is what they refer to it as. So if you stole stuff, if you were looting, you might still be punished by your own country. Now, if you are a soldier in a country that doesn't tend to respect the Geneva Convention, you might never get punished for that. But if you lose, then there is a chance that you will get tried by the winning power, or you might face a war crimes trial in The Hague. So those would be the two ways out, or the two methods of dealing with someone who committed war crimes.
This is the punishment element of it. This is where you would face justice for crimes that are committed.
Yes, and if you don't happen to lose, and the host nation decides not to pursue you, then it's certainly possible you might never be brought up on charges, and you get away with it.
So this is still an international agreement, which tends to be fast and loose because not every country thinks it's in their best interest to play along with every international agreement, and you can see the example of that in the UN, which is oftentimes a lot more bark than bite in terms of in terms of punishment for various different elements.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the one thing that has sort of changed a little bit is that now with instant communication, you can actually send images of war crimes being committed all across the world, and that if you are that power that is invading another country, that could really be a black eye on your reputation. But on the other hand, some of those countries could provide false evidence of the other side's war crimes. And I can foresee a point one day where video evidence isn't even going to be able to be accepted in court. Because with the advent of AI, or with all the disinformation out there, it is very easy to trick people, to fool people into thinking they're seeing something, especially when they don't understand exactly what they're looking at.
Can you give me an example of somebody that has been tried for war crimes?
Yes, Lindy England.
Okay.
Lindy England, Private First Class Lindy England. She was a soldier in a military police unit that was at the Abu Ghraib prison. And not making an excuse here whatsoever, that for those users who don't know, when the United States first invaded Iraq during Operation Iraqi Freedom, there was a prison called Abu Ghraib, which was an Iraqi-run prison. The U.S. took over that particular prison, and they would send detainees to Abu Ghraib because, hey, free prison, we're just going to repurpose it. And some prisoners were treated very poorly. And by very poorly, I don't mean they were smacked around a little bit.
Yeah.
I would say for Arab men to be stripped naked and looked at by women would be very humiliating. It's humiliating for everyone. You don't have to be Arab.
Yeah.
Right? Some men were placed in stress positions. Some men were forced to lie on each other in a naked pile with bags over their head. One person was forced to stand on a box, an MRE ration box, and told if you step down off this box, you're going to be electrocuted. There were men who were not attacked by dogs, but threatened with attack by dogs. There were men who were forced to. Am I allowed to say the word masturbate?
Sure.
I don't know if you're.
Yes.
There were men who
I think we are in a very clinical discussion for
Okay.
which specificity matters. Yes.
There were men who were forced to masturbate. From what I understand, reading the report, there was one case of a woman who was engaged in relations with an MP, a military policeman's dog.
Okay.
This is not okay.
Yes.
None of that is okay. But one of the people who engaged in these behaviors was a private named Lindy England, and she was punished, I believe it was 2 years in Leavenworth for her crimes. And now, she's in her 40s, I believe, can't hold a job. Everybody knows who she is. Her life is ruined. And there was nobody. Apparently, nobody was watching these soldiers to say, like, hey, you need to stop. We can't do this. And what's even worse is that the soldiers took pictures of themselves doing this stuff.
And for those of you who are, it's crazy now that I'm realizing that this scandal might be something that happened too long ago for some of our listeners, but this was a massive international scandal, and among the moments of true tipping points in America's understanding of how the military was pursuing the war in Iraq. That and waterboarding were probably the two mainstream moments where things were going too far as from the domestic perspective.
Yeah, I'm not sure they were doing any waterboarding in Abu Ghraib. It just wasn't. They weren't the kind of prisoners that. I don't know if they were set up to do that. And I also think a lot of those military police. Some of them didn't have training in corrections. The Army used to have a corrections MOS, or a corrections military occupational specialty, a corrections job. And I believe that job was just folded into the regular military police MOS. So they didn't have a lot of supervision. They didn't know what they were doing. And there were probably intel guys that were edging them on. Like, yeah, do this. It's okay. I'm an intel guy. Yeah, it's okay.
Is that in the report?
It's not okay. It's not okay.
Is that in the report that there were intel guys egging them on?
That's my personal opinion.
Gotcha.
Because I don't think these MPs thought of this stuff themselves. I think some of this were intel
was fed to them by somebody.
But it was fed to them because some of this is really creative. Like, hey, let's get this guy to stand on a box.
Yeah.
Like that's not like. Who thinks it? Like, you have to be pretty messed up in the head to think of that.
That's not something that you're coming up with in a Piggly Wiggly parking lot. That is
Someone, I think someone else was manipulating these people, but there was no supervision, and there should have been.
Yeah. And ultimately, these pictures became an international scandal, and the person that was probably the most animated in the pictures was Lindy England. And she faced consequences for that. Now, would that be, just to get back to our definitional element of that, would that be a violation of the rules of engagement, the LOAC, or the Geneva Convention?
It would be a violation of the LOAC, and the rules of engagement tend to be about shooting your rifle.
Conflict, okay.
When you can actually fire and when you can't. And it could also be about, like, hey, if the insurgents run into a mosque, you're not allowed to shoot at that mosque. You have to stop and you have to call the Iraqi police, and the Iraqi police or Iraqi army, they take out the mosque.
Gotcha.
It could be about that. So that particular event, Abu Ghraib, would be a violation of the Geneva Convention because you're not allowed to put prisoners in humiliating situations, and it would be a violation of the law of armed conflict. There is nothing that's in either of those books, the Geneva Conventions or the Law of Armed Conflict, that say that is okay.
Yeah.
It's not okay.
So she faced punishment from the United States largely because the newly reconstituted Iraq did not want to bring her to The Hague or bring those people to The Hague?
So typically when the U.S., and this is actually a huge problem, there is another thing called a SOFA agreement. Now at the time, SOFA means status of forces.
Okay.
So that's actually one of the reasons we left Iraq. Iraq did not have the ability to bring anybody under charges at The Hague because they didn't even have a government. They were a basket case in 2003, 2004.
Yeah.
One of the reasons the U.S. left Iraq was that Iraq wanted to be able to charge soldiers for war crimes if they felt those soldiers should be charged. And the U.S. said, no, we're not doing that. And that's why we left Iraq in 2010. Now, we came back.
Yeah.
But if there are U.S. soldiers in any country on earth, that country has what's called a SOFA agreement, a status of forces agreement with that local host nation. And the SOFA agreement spells out everything that is the responsibility of the host nation and everything that is the responsibility of the American government. So if a soldier commits a crime, the SOFA agreement might say that if a soldier commits a crime, that soldier is to be tried by the American government. But they can specify the crime.
Yeah.
One of the things that you see quite frequently is Marines and sailors on the island of Okinawa in Japan. They might commit a rape in Okinawa. And because our status of forces agreement says that the U.S. will try these Marines or sailors if they commit a rape, the Okinawans get very upset when this happens because to them the sailor just poof, he's
just
right
gone.
out of the
but
country.
he doesn't face local justice for being on Okinawan property when this crime happens.
Correct. And maybe he did face justice back in the U.S. or maybe there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. But yeah, do you want justice or do you want vengeance? Right?
Sure.
Like, what's this? Because if you want to live under laws, you have to agree that what is justice might not always make you happy. Right?
Yeah.
But also the SOFA agreement covers things like driver's licenses. Do you have to get a local driver's license when you come to that country? Stuff like that. So SOFA agreement, it can be basically anything from whether a soldier is allowed to bring personal weapons to that country, to shoot at local target ranges, to driver's licenses, to how soldiers might be charged if they commit a crime. So.
But those are more along the lines of if you put a base, a foreign base or something in another country, and now you have to deal with the logistics of all that. I want to get into two issues broadly that have come up a lot, specifically both in Ukraine and Gaza. And one are protected classes of people that wind up dead in war, and the other is the specificity of where something is being attacked. Let's start with the protected classes first. In any of those, the Geneva Convention, LOAC, or rules of engagement, are there broadly understood to be classes of people, let's say women and children specifically, that are absolutely, no matter what, off limits if you are found to be attacking or to have deliberately killed a specific class of person? That is a war crime.
Well, it's not just class, it's also infrastructure.
Okay.
So what you would consider a protected class is any medical personnel could be considered a protected class. Police can also be considered a protected class. Local police are not supposed to be disarmed because someone still has to provide local security, although you might patrol with those local police, and if they're giving you any trouble, all right, well, now it's on. And civilians. So civilians, local police, you could also say emergency services, fire, and medical personnel. They would be a protected class. There are protected buildings, things like hospitals, cultural sites such as churches, and sites of major infrastructure. One example might be dams. Things like dams are not supposed to be destroyed or targeted. Now, if any of those particular sites, let's say a school or a mosque or whatever, is being used as a military base, they lose that special protection. And that's one of the things you've been seeing in Gaza, where you'll have, and this is actually, believe it or not, something I actually don't agree with, where Israelis will go into a mosque and they'll go, oh, there was an arms room here, or there was a base here, command control center here, we're going to blow up this whole mosque. Now, explosives are heavy.
Yeah.
They're freaking heavy. And so it's there. I do not believe Israel is doing this for fun. They are doing this because they genuinely want to get rid of a particular command and control center. And I think some of it is also saying, look, if you decide to do this, we're going to blow up your mosque and you're going to have to rebuild it. And I believe the American military would not do something like that. But when we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're trying to win hearts and minds. We might clear out the insurgents. We might destroy the equipment in that particular room. We won't necessarily bring down the entire mosque. So it's kind of a different theory of operations that you're seeing. But there are protected buildings and certain
but as you mentioned, there are carve-outs that would obviously lead to rationale and decision-making in the field. And so if it is your claim, like the IDF has claimed, that hospitals or mosques are being used as active military bases, then that is their justification for going outside of that. Now, we get to a question like Iraq, where it is hard for Iraq to come to an international court because their government was a mess. Just strictly looking at this as a procedural issue, if somebody wanted to bring war crimes charges for, let's say, exactly that, blowing up a mosque or a hospital against Israel, does it have to be, I mean, in this case, it would be Hamas, which effectively runs Gaza and ran Gaza beforehand? Would it have to be, can it be somebody else from the international community, or does it have to be the organization that is running the area that something like this happens?
That's actually probably a better question for a lawyer.
Okay, gotcha. Then we can move on. We can move on. So let's get to targeting, because that is something else that not only, and I guess there is some shared DNA here between these two questions of if something that is in a protected class is actually acting as something else, then there are different rules of engagement. When it comes to targeting certain areas, what are some of the rationale that goes into that?
Well, one would be military necessity. So, in the LOAC and the Geneva Convention, you're only supposed to destroy as much as you need to destroy to accomplish the mission.
Yeah.
So if you don't need to destroy a bridge, don't destroy that bridge. You're not supposed to destroy targets just for the heck of it, right? So that's kind of the general guiding spirit when it comes to targeting. And also, don't forget that weapon systems have a dollar value attached to them. Mm-hmm. And in modern day conflict, if you use a particular weapon system, you may not be able to get a replacement immediately. There is I'm sure you've heard there is a backlog of artillery production. There are in some cases Israel has run out or has come close to running out of precision guided kits for their bombs. So you want to make sure that what you're hitting not only has military value but is worth expending that particular piece of ordnance on. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of number one when it comes to targeting. So you're taking that into account, and you're also taking into account, are there civilians near the area, or is there a protected building near the area? If Daddy El-Badi is in a hospital, and we know that Daddy El-Badi is a major militia commander.
Yeah.
But there's also other civilians in that hospital. Is it worth dropping a bomb through a window where we know Daddy El-Badi is? All right, so let's go through the process. Well, is it going to kill Daddy El-Badi? Yes. How many civilians is it going to kill? All right, there might actually be a number where it says, all right, well, if it's 10 to 15, 0 to 15 civilians that this can kill, we have to get permission from the brigade commander. If it's 15 to 30, we have to get permission from the division commander. If it's above 30, we have to get permission from the theater commander or the White House to strike this particular target. Or you might do some weaponeering where you say, all right, instead of using a 500-pound bomb, let's use a 250-pound bomb. Let's use a smaller warhead, or let's use a Hellfire missile to try to take this guy out, which will eliminate the collateral damage. So that's another thing you kind of want to think. Are there other targets around that particular target that could be affected? by an explosion? Is there is there a school nearby?
Yeah.
What time do the kids get out of school?
Yeah.
One of the things that I've heard people talk about in Gaza is they say that people have been killed while sleeping by Israeli bombs. And that is possible, but Israel, for the most part, they tend to be bombing during the day, mainly because during the day people are out of their homes and looking for food.
Yeah.
And if you kind of wondered, like, why isn't Israel, giving aid to? Well, in some ways, that could be a tactic, because by making people spend their days looking for food, it gets them out of those buildings.
Yeah.
And Hamas doesn't have doesn't need to go out looking for food. They have supplies stashed away. So now that allows you to safely target places and minimize collateral damage and minimize civilians killed. So that might be a thing as well, looking at what time it is and when is the best time to drop a piece of ordnance to minimize the amount of people that have to die.
And all of that is, a very, very ugly calculation that you have to make, in war are being made during this specific incursion. And that's, from my perspective, there is, obviously a empathetic element that you look at any kind of war, beyond war, just any kind of a targeted attack on any area that happens throughout our world. Our world is, a very, very brutal place when you look throughout all of the hotspots that exist. And then you get into the specifics. And that's why, thank you so much for coming on. But it just has, it's one of those things that I want to get a better sense of, is just what do we actually mean when it comes to these things? Because war is hell, war is ugly, war is brutal, and I don't know where those lines are. But I greatly thank you sharing your expertise and just giving us a baseline primer.
Oh, absolutely, Justin. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Ryan, please tell everybody where they can get more of your work.
Well, you can find me at ryanmcbeth.substack.com. You can connect with me on Twitter at Ryan McBeth. I'm also on Instagram as the real Ryan McBeth, and I do have a website that I update once in a while. It's ryanmcbeth.com.
What are some of the things that you've posted about recently?
Oh boy. Recently, I posted about this Russian AWACS, or Airborne Warning or Airborne Control Center. It's essentially an AWACS is a plane that has a big radar dish on it, and it flies in circles above the battlefield and uses its radar to find enemy aircraft and direct friendly aircraft toward the enemy aircraft, and also maybe manage the battle space. Well, I believe the second Russian A-50 was shot down by Ukraine in 30 days. And they didn't build a lot of these things. I believe they have between 3 and 7 A-50s remaining. And that's an issue because, number one, there's about 15 crew on an A-50 on one of these AWACS planes.
Okay.
And so now you have 15 professionals who were highly educated and knew how to manage the battle space. All those guys are gone. They're dead. You also have one fewer aircraft, and it makes it more difficult to perform maintenance on the existing aircraft. So if you want to perform 24-hour operations, it's a lot easier to do that with 7 aircraft than it is with 3. So that is a major event. Russia is suffering this death of 1,000 cuts in Ukraine, where when you take away an AWACS, you take away their ability to do targeting, weaponeering, surveillance, deconfliction, which is a major thing. Deconfliction is where you tell your surface-to-air missile batteries, hey, we have friendly jets coming in from the east, don't shoot for the next 2 minutes. And deconfliction is hard. We screw it up.
Yeah.
Russia has had major problems doing deconfliction. It's a lot harder to do deconfliction when you don't have an AWACS circling above the battlefield. So that is one thing Ukraine is so good at. It is shaping the battlefield. It's forming what's called shaping operations. They are great at that, at setting themselves up for the next success. So I recently did a video about that, and I also recently I did a video on technicals.
Okay.
Technicals are, I'm sure you've watched Black Hawk Down. You've seen pickup trucks and someone bolts a machine gun to the back. I did a video that's all about technicals.
Oh,
and
wow.
It gets into the history of technicals. So during the technicals were actually first used, you really want to go all the way back, the Rat Patrol in World War II, the British Rat Patrol rolling around the desert in jeeps. Those were technicals, kind of, right? And the Chad-Libya war, when Chad was fighting Libya, America and France and Egypt and Sudan actually said, "Hey, do you want tanks?" And the Chadians were like, "We're good. We just need pickup trucks. We can bolt machine guns to them." They started becoming called technicals during Somalia, during the famine in Somalia, when aid agencies were attempting to feed Somalis, because you couldn't put on an expense report "bribe to warlord." So they would put the word "technical payments."
Gotcha.
Bribe to warlord.
Yeah.
And those vehicles began to be called technicals.
And that's what we know them as now.
That's what we call them today.
Well, folks, if you want more of this kind of expertise, and specifically in times of war, which we are in right now, I think that it is tremendously, tremendously important. That and the misinformation work that I think that you've done since I've started being a regular consumer of your work is very, very, very well worth it. Go ahead and find Mr. Ryan McBeth. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Justin.